A lot of ships go together.
Convoy.
A convoy. Theirs was the last ship, and they were followed by a German submarine most of the time. And he said they'd look out and they could see it out there. Yeah. But they got safely, and he went to England, and he was about maybe 30 miles outside of London. He told me that he wanted to see London, so he took a bus in and started walking around. Here comes one of those bombs from Germany, you know, those
V2s?
Yeah. And about a block from where he was. So he decided he better not stay in London. He took the bus back to the field.
Who is this? So I get on record. This was Uncle Wally.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so
he was an optometrist, and at that time, during World War II, they wouldn't let optometrists, when they were brought into the Army, be officers. They had to be enlisted men. Today it's different.
Really?
Today they're
well, you see, when he left, discharged, they offered him if he'd stay in the reserve, they'd give him.
Well, I remember he had a patch over his eye, and he had some operations while he was still in the armed forces. I have this picture of Uncle Wally in a uniform with some kind of a surgery that was done on his eye.
Well, you know, Bob had inherited the same trouble that Wally had, but Wally went all over to find a cure for Bob, and he took him to this place, I think it was in St. Louis, Missouri, a very fine eye surgeon, and they did something, I don't know what, but it fixed Bob's eyes. I mean, not Bob, Donald's eyes.
At what age was that?
Well, I think
been real
he was
young.
a grown-up boy, about 19 or so, I think.
Okay.
But see, Wally had trouble with that. I think there was a little imbalance there.
He was never happy about anything.
It must have been probably pretty hard for Wally, but he was determined that Donald would go through that, and that's why he had it done. Donald and Bob never seemed to really be fond of their father.
I have this feeling that because he played so much golf on the weekends, that they felt like they were abandoned by him.
Yes, well, I remember saying to Wally that he shouldn't do that. And Esther said to me, don't discourage him. If he doesn't play golf, he'll probably be terrible. So I didn't say anymore.
But I do remember writing Uncle Wally a couple of years. It was years after I left Vietnam, and I was feeling sorry for myself because I went to Vietnam. There were no parades, there was nothing going on for Vietnam veterans. This was before the wall was built and all of that. And I remember thinking, well, why would you expect people to thank you for serving our country? You have never thanked your relatives, your Uncle Wally, your Uncle Dick, all these people that served in World War II. Why don't you start giving some thanks to those people? So I wrote a letter to Wally, and I said, Dear Uncle Wally, and I said, you probably heard this from many members of the family, but I want to tell you, after serving in Vietnam, I really understand what it is to be away from your family. And I want to thank you for what you did for our country. And he wrote me back, and he wrote this long letter, really long, about what it was like to be in World War II. And he said I was the only person that ever wrote him a letter and said thank you.
Oh, I'm sure of that.
And he said it was so touching to him. He said he felt compelled to write me a letter.
Yeah.
I have that letter somewhere. I have to find it. But I made a copy, and I sent it to Donald, and I sent it to Bob, and I sent it to my uncle, and said, this is your dad's memories of what it was like to be in World War II. But I have a feeling that the gap between their dad and them was so wide that
John Loarie
they may have read the letter and just thrown it away. I don't know.
his sickness.
I got that feeling all the time from Marilyn. I mean, Mary Lou, not Marilyn. And my son Paul and Eleanor were in Chicago, and they were getting a car from Henry's aunt, and they were going to drive it to D.C. And they stayed at Wally's. And when Eleanor said the tension at the dinner table was terrible. And she said everybody was on edge.
I'm licensed here to
The
practice.
least little thing would start, you know. And so she said she and Paul were so glad to
I'm not
meet.
too interested.
Was this after
This
Jane
cancer
died?
thing is really cut down.
Trying to think now.
See, because I think some of the issues have to do with
I felt tired after about 2
Jane
hours.
passing on
And then
and how they dealt with it. I'm not sure, but I just get this feeling that Jane's,
I'm still on.
Well, you know,
the whole thing came unglued.
Wally called me after Jane when he just found out. And he told me how the police officers came to the door
Months to a year
and
to
asked him
figure out
if they have his daughter
Well, we'll
Jane.
put you into the
And he was so broken up over the phone, and I was so far away.
Don't actually.
And so I
I'm getting better.
called people as fast as I could to notify them, about it. But
Well, I was really uncomfortable.
the thing was, he kept blaming himself because he said they
I
should
was
have
sore, you
known
know. I just,
Jane was getting so thin. And when they looked in the refrigerator of her apartment, there was nothing in there.
she's
And she apparently was very fond of some young man.
That's what we heard. Marie
Yeah.
said that.
Yeah,
Had something to do with her boyfriend, and
yeah, and he didn't
rejected
want to
her.
get married.
Yes.
Had been
got
married
good
or
doctors.
divorced or whatever.
Yeah.
And she wanted to marry and have children, and he wasn't a bit interested, and I think she was pretty brokenhearted about it. But Wally blamed himself for not noticing. But you can't tell those things, you know. So, but I felt about it badly myself because we were in Chicago a year before she died. And you know, one of the things I noticed was that Jane was saying, you know, she was doing quite well, Jane Walter Thompson.
Yeah.
And she mentioned that she got a raise and a promotion, and they said to her brothers, said, you know, well, how much are you making? And I think it was something like, what was it, 20,000, something like that, which I thought was great. But they were saying, you know, they weren't a bit impressed or praised her or anything. And I said to Jane, well, why don't you come out to the West Coast, you know, and stay with us for a while and see how you like it and everything. But she wasn't interested. And one thing I noticed too was that when her sister married, Jane was the one that directed the whole wedding, you might say. She planned everything and all that. And of course, Marilyn felt bad because she thought she should have done something. But you know, if they're going to commit suicide, they'll do it. But Wally was just so crushed. But I don't think Esther really realized what was happening because, you know, she was already having trouble. But I was very proud of Wally because he took such good care of Esther. He told me he got this black woman to come in, you know, be with her and clean and stuff while he went out for a while. But she got a bitter job, and that's when he decided he couldn't handle it because she was going out at midnight in her nightgown and things like that.
You're right. So nobody can do it 24/7.
No.
So that's why I understand completely.
Let's kind of go back to my dad.
Okay.
He went to, first of all, when was Honor and Granddad married? I can figure it out from the 50th wedding anniversary, but
1907.
1907. And what was the date?
When they were married, June 26th,
June 26th. And when was Honor's birthday?
February 4th.
February 4th. And when was John L. Laurie's birthday? It was in
His
July.
July 18th.
July 18th. And we've come to recognize that Willard will be 100 years old next July.
I thought that too.
And I've talked to my family a little bit about we should have
Everybody. Right. That's a good idea.
Well, I mean, but there's 8 million.
Yes. Well,
I get very emotional.
well, good for you. So do I.
And they treat me
Well,
as a
yeah, Willard was a great guy, I thought. And as I said before, he cared so much about the rest of us, tried to help all of us. And very, very good. I don't think he would have ever taken to alcohol if it wasn't for J. Walter Thompson and some of those other jobs, because he was trying so hard to earn a living and everything. And
Well, I know what the pressure is of raising a family of 6 kids, and you know what the pressure is.
yes, but another thing, Eleanor tried working in an advertising agency, and she said it was awful. You know, you got to deliver right away, you know, all the time.
It's still like that today.
Yeah.
Even worse.
Right. And he said that these young men were coming in, and they were his competitors. And also, he would take them out to lunch. That was the beginning of these couple of martinis lunch. I was so surprised. No, Lucille never told us that he had become an alcoholic.
Well, she was in denial.
But first of all, out of loyalty to her spouse, the last people she would want to share something with that, where the highest respect for my dad existed, would be a brother and a sister. She couldn't do that to him.
Well, I know, but we thought it was too bad that we were
She doesn't.
share something.
I agree. I totally agree.
Well, when we were young,
Glenn was in bad
I was probably 6 years old. He had a serious drinking problem.
None of us was ever
And he got help. He went to AA. And he became a good friend with a fellow from Notre Dame by the name of Red O'Connell. Red O'Connell lived in Skokie, Illinois. And my dad often would have Red over to the house, or we would go to Red's house. I didn't quite understand the whole thing. But Red was his sponsor. And Red was the guy that helped Richard get into Notre Dame. He wrote a recommendation to the university to get Richard into Notre Dame. Red had played at Notre Dame. He was a famous football player at Notre Dame. And
That's
he was
why
a
all of
close.
you went to Notre Dame.
Well, Richard started the tradition, and it helped. But the drinking problem, when I was 6 years old, kind of ended. What we know today is that there's more to just stopping drinking. There's certain things you have to work on in your inside yourself, because there's a lot of anger and pent up feelings. My dad never could hug anybody, not because hugging wasn't what he wanted wanted to do, but because of a culture that we lived in the 50s was that men didn't hug people, okay? If he was alive today and he was comfortable in his skin, he would be the biggest hugger you ever met. He was an emotional person. He was a person with a lot of love, and he couldn't really express it the way our society allows him to do it today. And I believe that it was a lot of repressed. These are the rules of society. That's how you live in this world. And all of that goodness that he had inside of himself had to be pent up. And I believe that if he could have released some of that and shown some of that, okay, that he would have been more at peace with himself. But that's my own theory of his dilemma. Secondly, my mother was an idol worshiper of her father. Richard Finnegan could do nothing, okay, wrong, and he was the idol. And no matter, I can just feel that if I was my dad, I would always be in the shadow of Richard Finnegan. There's nothing I could ever do to get her to say, you're great, you're wonderful. Because as I was growing up, Dad was okay, but Richard Finnegan, your grandfather, is great. And I felt that if I was in a marriage, okay, where I was always in the shadow of this man, I don't know how I could deal with the emotional feelings I had about this. And I've shared this with Tom and some of my brothers, that Dad had this, and it was overblown. Richard Finnegan was a human being, and he obviously had some faults somewhere. I don't know what they are, but the reality is that my mother put him on such a pedestal. Even to her dying day, she was trying to work on a story about Richard Finnegan.
Oh, I know she
And she was saving papers and things and so forth. And Mary Lou said she went out and interviewed a couple of people, and they all went back to Dad, and they said, your dad, Willard Loarie, is such a funny guy and a fun person to be around, and blah, blah, and he's such a generous person and so forth, okay? And Richard Finnegan fell in the background, and Willard Loarie was the star of the conversation. But yet my mother didn't see it that way. Mary Lou said, I was so surprised. I learned stories about my dad, and I learned more about my dad than I ever knew.
Well, you know, Lucille didn't have the same kind of sense of humor.
No.
She didn't. You know, Willard was over at the house one time, and we had a new record of Bill Cosby. And how funny he is. And I thought Will was going to fall off the couch. She was laughing so hard. Lucille was sitting there.
They come in and stamp
She tolerated it.
Stoic.
Yeah, right. She just had that kind of humor. Our family all had that sense of humor. And when Willard came over, we were always laughing. Yeah, I enjoyed having him with us so much. He was certainly a good brother.
Didn't he paid for, or helped pay for Aunt Gwen to go to Mundelein? Is that right?
Gwen never went to Mundelein. I went to
You went to Mundelein.
He didn't pay for it. What happened was that he and Lucille offered to send me to Lake Forest College. And I didn't see any reason why they should pay for it. But you know, my father didn't approve of women getting more education. I won a scholarship
Notre Dame was
to
not favored at all.
for 2
Notre
years.
Dame was
I was the top in my class. And so I expected my dad.
Well, Notre Dame,
And it wasn't that expensive really, but Dad just thought women shouldn't bother with higher education.
Just have babies and be moms and wives and stay at home.
The old Italian way.
and as it turned out,
All that generation.
Probably.
Same thing with the Germans.
Right. So So, but I wouldn't accept it from Loarie and Lucille because I knew they were working hard just to keep up with their own little family. But I appreciated it. So.
I've heard stories that my dad was given a scholarship by the president of Harvard.
Not the president, but he was given a scholarship to Harvard.
To Harvard because of something that happened.
He was at Senn High School. He and Nat Samuels and Lucille were the board that were running the newspaper. It came out every week. It was large as a regular daily newspaper. Herb Block used to do the cartoon on the front page. Will had a column inside, and his name was Collagen. And it was very clever. And every week, he and Nat Samuels would go out, interview some outstanding person like the mayor of Chicago.
That's a good
Willard would sketch a drawing of him, and Nat would be writing the story. So every week they'd have personality of the week. And so that was what attracted Harvard.
No.
And so Nat was able to go because his family had money. Dad would have liked to, but he couldn't come up with enough money besides the scholarships. But I felt so bad for him. Because I knew he would have loved to have gone. But Will did his own education. He went to the Art Institute. And while he was there, he met Walt Disney. Did he ever tell you that?
No.
Yeah.
Tell me about meeting Walt Disney. What did you know about that?
Well, I never met him myself, but he was in some of the classes with Will. And he told Will he was going down to California to start doing some of this animation stuff. And Willard was so involved with Lucille and things here, so he didn't go down with him.
So Walt invited him out to California, and because of Lucille and other commitments, he turned him down. And this was in the 1930s, right?
It must have been, yes.
So they went to school
They weren't married yet.
Music. By the time I came, like,
No.
Imagine what would happen there.
Well, Lucille, of course, went down to the University of Illinois, and so did Ruth, and that's where Ruth met Freddie Morris.
Freddie Morris.
Yeah, yeah, he had a little band in college that kind of was his way of making some money. And I liked Fred. He was very nice, quiet man, and Ruth was just nutty over him. And when he died, I remember going over to the Finnegan house, and Ruth was in one of the rooms back there. You could hear her crying all over the house. Mr. Finnegan came to the door, and he looked completely worn out. But you know, later she met Charles Corcoran and was gaga over him. And Ruth was a very pretty woman, and she enjoyed laughing. I remember we'd go over to Finnegan's house, and we would play all kinds of games, adult games, you know, and they all enjoyed them very much. I remember laughing a lot over there. It was very nice.
How many children with Fred Morris? Ruth?
He had 2 girls, I believe.
Jane and Mary.
One day I was out wheeling Richard in a buggy, and I had Lassie with me and the oldest little girl, and we were walking all around Sheridan Road.
And then one thing I want to go back to with Willard and Walt Disney, did they go to school together? Is that how
The
they
Art
met?
Institute of Chicago.
That's where they met, was the Art Institute of Chicago.
They must have been in the same classes. But another thing, Willard brought all kinds of books with, and you know, and really educated himself.
He liked to learn, he liked to study.
Right. Well, I don't think he would have cared for math or science, but books. I loved it because he'd bring home all these magazines and I could read them.
That's great.
Yeah.
That explains why I hate math. I was never good at it at all.
What was it like
Across the board
in
reduction in the arts everywhere in the public system.
my dad was born in 1908, okay, so he'd been 10 years old in 1918. Like, when was the family, when did they get their first car?
It was about 1922. It was a Hupmobile.
Hupmobile.
No, excuse me, that was the second car. The first car was a Chevy.
A Chevy.
Yeah, and it was, and it was an open car. And I remember Dad bringing the car home, and we were all excited. We came out. Everybody in the block came out, and nobody else had a car yet. And so the men were all hanging over the car, opening the hood, looking at it.
Checking everything out.
Right. And they kept saying, well, we think you could do better, you know, or you should have done this. That's right. But Dad, we went about 15 miles an hour in the car, and we kids were supposed to keep an eye on any car coming from any direction and say, Dad, somebody's coming up here. You think they'd drive you nuts, but he seemed to want it to. And you didn't take
Did you wear a straw hat too?
No, he didn't. No, he liked the camp.
Did he smoke cigars or smoke a pipe? Smoke a pipe?
Yeah. I remember a little game my father and I pulled on the rest of the family. I would go out of the room and he would have 3 playing cards, like 3 jacks, and I was supposed to say which one he touched while I was out of the room. So I would go out and come back in, and I'd look at Dad, and he was smoking a pipe, and he'd move the pipe like this. And I would just take one look at him, and then I'd look at the cards, and I'd say, that's the one. And everyone, how did you do that? Dad and I had a big time with that.
You should have gone to Las Vegas and brought him with you.
Right, yeah. Well, Dad taught us how to play poker.
Really?
We used,
She came from Boston.
what do you call it,
She's a little bit older.
little
She's from Mary
toothpicks.
And we get along.
And I really enjoyed learning, but then he'd end up by saying, never gamble.
Now, he wasn't a Catholic when he started in that marriage, right?
Well, he probably was baptized into the Catholic Church.
But he was Anglican or
No,
Episcopal?
no,
Nothing.
nothing, until Mother met him.
And then your mother,
Mother said,
Yeah.
you learn about the Catholic Church or else I won't marry you. And so he went to a priest at DePaul University. He was taking classes in there, higher math, and this priest led him through it and baptized him again. So and every Sunday he went to Mass, and once a month he went to the Holy Name Society. But that was a hardship because he couldn't have his coffee or his pipe until after Mass. So it was a real sacrifice.
Well, apparently it was worth it.
Yeah.
He started, when he got out of the Army, he worked for the post office,
Yes, and he sold insurance at night.
sold insurance at night. And then eventually, the insurance business was good enough that he could quit the post office. And he had a hernia all that time, is that right?
Right, and that's when they wore these, the metal kind of strip with balls. Later on,
He never had an operation to correct the hernia. So he lived his whole life with a hernia.
right. Well, and so did my father.
This is Richard Finnegan?
My,
Or
no, this was my father.
your father?
John, Loarie,
problem.
typically,
That's what
I
I
remember
enjoy
my
it.
dad saying something that in those days, the work week didn't end until about Saturday noon.
That's
We all
It
right.
was normal to work on Saturdays.
Different parts of California.
Yeah, and he
We're
always
in the
would bring home
roughly the
a
same neighborhood.
bag
Johnstown
of
and
broken
Southern
milk
California.
chocolate.
Orange County.
That was our
Jim
treat.
came back
So
from
when he'd
Illinois.
come in, I'd come over and
It's good.
get
Well,
and I'd always
thing
find
was,
a bag of
we need to come
chocolates
up
for
here
me.
and see you all.
Okay, everyone.
And you told me a story one
Got to be a
time.
great
Salmon is ready.
opportunity.
Yeah.
And the protocol is to get a plate, meat at the grill. Mary will scoop you off a piece. There's condiments on the table. There's rolls in there as well.
Oh boy.
And it's a very simple meal. We have salmon, rolls, and salad. Wonderful. We'll bring the salad out as well.
Okay, ladies, let's get up. March out.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.